In our previous lecture, we learnt and talked about how shake gestures can perform actions without our users interacting with our screen whatsoever. We're going to be taking what we learned in our previous lecture and creating our sixth application of the course with a simple Shake Me game. Now, how this game is going to work is our user is going to press a button to start the game and it's going to trigger a countdown from 10 to 0. It's then up to our users to shake our application or device as many times as they can within the allotted time and see what score they can get before our timer hits 0. Now obviously the more they shake, the more points they're going to get. So they're going to get a point for every time they shake their device. And they can compete with their friends for who can shake the most within 10 seconds or however many the time limit you want to set. So what we're going to do is go into our main.storyboard. I'm going to change our screen size here to an iPhone screen. And then we're going to add in our objects for which we need. So we're going to need 2 labels and a button. So the first our button will trigger to start our game. So we add that in, and I'll simply name it Start Game. Oh, if I spell it correctly. There we go. And then we're going to have an additional label here, which will start counting down from 10. So if I center that, and then change the text to simply 10. And then our second label, which I'll just copy and paste this as it's already set up. This will keep a track of how many times we're shaking our device. So this will be our score. So I'm going to set this to 0, as our score is already going to be set at 0 anyway when we start the game. Okay, so we got those in, and we need to bring up our assistant editor, and then make sure it's selected on our viewcontroller.h so we can add in our actions and outlets. So what we're going to do is first start by creating our NS timers and our ints. Now we've used these heavily a lot in our previous applications we've made in our course, and we learnt about them in their own lectures. So we're doing what we've done previously, so creating our parentheses here, and then we can start by creating our timer for our countdown. So we start by typing NS timer space asterisk, and I simply name it timer, nice and easy, and then that with a semicolon. I also need to create an int for that timer. So we go int, and I simply name this one count int. Making sure that's got a semicolon on. And then we need to create an int for our score. So we just name this one our score int, so we can keep track of it. And then we also need a third int. Now this int is for the mode of game. So because when we shake our device, we can shake it basically at any time. So by creating a mode int, if our game is in mode 1, when we shake our device, it can add points. But if our game is in mode 2, which is when the game has ended, then we cannot shake our device to add any points. So this is a very important part. So we just call this our mode int. And then that with a semicolon, making sure that our score int also has a semicolon. Okay, so we've got both of those on. We're now going to drag some outlets for our labels. So we start with our time one here. This will be our timer label. So this will be counting down our time. We'll also have our score label. So this will be adding score every time we shake our device. I'm dragging one for our button. And I simply name this Start Game. There we go, changing that to an action. And we also need an outlet for our button. Now the reason we need an outlet for our button is purely for the fact that when we are playing the game, we need to disable our button so our users can't press the start game and restart the whole game mid-game. So the button will disable when we play it, and then once we finish playing, it will then re-enable itself. So I'll simply name this our start button, making sure that's an outlet. Okay. So now we got that, we're going to jump into our viewcontroller.m, where you see it's added in our button here. I'm going to space it out because what we're going to start with is creating our timer. Now when the view loads up, we're already going to have our 2 ints, our count int to equal 10 and our score int to equal 0, as they're the default ints that we want to be selected when it first loads up. We don't need to worry about our mode int just yet because that will come into play when we press our button. So how we're going to start then is by simply creating our timer to count down from 10 to 0. So what we're going to do is create an if statement. So if our score int is equal to 0, And the reason we're doing this is because every time we play it and we come to restarting the game, to start the game, our score needs to be 0. So if our score equals 0, then we can start the game. So if our score equals 0, then we're going to set our count int here to equal 10. Even though we already set it to 10 in the view did load, this is for when we restart the game after we played it for the first time. Our mode int is going to equal 1. So mode int 1 means we can now play the game and shake our device. When we finish playing the game, we'll set our mode int to 2, so we can't shake the device no more. But we'll configure that up when we set it to be able to shake. We're then going to get our self.timelabel.text to simply equal our bracket ns string with format to equal our @ symbol, 2 quotation marks, we do a comma to equal our simple count int, which will display our time. And by changing that within our 2 quotation marks to our percentage sign and the letter I, it will display it within our label. Okay, so once you've got that displayed within our label, we need now to then create our NS timer to keep looping itself every second to start counting down from 10 all the way down to 0. So we do that by doing our timer space equals space bracket our NS timer space schedule time with time interval in the target and the selector. So in our time interval here, we're going to set it to go in every second, as that's how much we want it to repeat. Our target, we're simply going to do self selector. We do @selector. Leave that highlighted for just a second. In our user info, we're going to do nil. And our repeats, we obviously want it to repeat, so we select yes. Okay. So in that highlighted section, that's going to trigger a void statement. And the void statement we're going to get to trigger, if I just type it out here, we do dash, bracket, and then we do void, bracket there. And I simply name this our start counter, our parentheses there, and I'll just copy that and place that within our selector there. So every second, it's going to repeat this NS timer. And the void statement we got it to repeat is our start counter. So how this is going to work, we're going to get our count int to take away 1 every time this void statement gets called. Now again, it's going to get called every time it repeats within 1 second. And then obviously we want to display that within our label. So if I just copy and paste that to save some time. So every time this statement gets called and it takes away 1, so when it starts at 10, it will take it away to 9, then display 9 within our label. And then again, a second later, it will repeat this line and then call this statement again. So it's already at 9, it will set it to 8 and then print that into our label. And then once it gets to 0, it will continue to carry on and on and on. So what we want to do is once it reaches 0, we want it to stop the timer so it can't go down any further. So once it hits 0, the game is completely over and the timer completely stops. So how we do that is go create an if statement. So if our count int is equal to 0, then in our void statement, we're going to get bracket our timer, which is our NS timer counting down, is going to invalidate. And that means it's going to completely stop it from working. Apart from stopping it from working, we're also going to get our mode int to then equal 2. So when it's playing, it's going to be mode int equal 1. And then when the timer stops to 0, which is game over, it's going to set it to 2. And we'll come to justifying when it knows to shake in those 2 modes when we come to set up the code for its shaking. But we've got that done now. So if we go to build and run and test it out, so we can start our game. It will start our countdown from 10 and it'll go all the way down 6, 5, 4. And once it hits 0, it shall then completely stop and not go any further. So there we go. But as you can see, right, now that we start game, we can press it again and it continues. And we can keep pressing it over and over and over again while the time is counted down and it just goes completely crazy and now it's broke. That's because we need to disable our button when our game is in play. So when we start our game and everything gets triggered, we're going to get simply our self.startButton.enabled to equal no. So we're going to disable our button when we start the game, making sure that no is capitalized. There we go. And then once our timer has finished and it invalidates it, we are then simply going to get our self dot start button again to enable to equal yes, and then that res semicolon. We're also going to change the text within our button so we can just tell our users that we can restart the game. So we do bracket self dot start button again, and we do space set title, and then the highlighted section here we're going to do simple @ symbol, 2 quotation marks, and our simple name restart there. And then for state we do UI control state normal. It just kind of leaves it as it is, and out of a bracket and a semicolon. Now, as you've seen then, when it restarts, it doesn't really set everything back to normal. We haven't kind of told it what to do when we press it once it restarts. So within our code here, just underneath our parentheses where we entered if our score equals 0 to start it, we're going to create a secondary if statement. So this time, if our count int is equal to 0, very much like how our it equals it 0 to invalidate it, is when we press our button, it's going to set our score int to equal 0. So this is when we restart our game. It's going to then set our count int to equal 10, which is our timer. It's then going to display both of those, if I just copy this one here first, both of those within their respectful labels. So if I copy 2 and then just change our first one to our score label, and making sure we change the int here to our score int. So it will display both of those within the 2 labels. It will then also, if we copy and paste in the code where it changes our button's title and change it from restart to simply start. So again, if I go to build and run and test this out, okay, so what's going to happen then? We press our start button, which will trigger our first if statement within our start button, which is if our score equals 0, then start the game basically. So we press it, it will disable the button as we set it to enabled no. It starts our countdown from 10, and once it hits 0, it's going to read this if statement in our button here, in our finger here, which if our count equals 0, then invalidate timer, it will set the game mode to 2, and then it will change the text in our button to restart, and it re-enables our button. And then once we press our restart button, because now our count is equaling 0, and it's all at the bottom, we press it, and it restarts the game and repeats that same process. So now we've got our loop that continues revolving every time we start and finish the game. So we basically got all that set up. All that's left to do now is add in the ability to start shaking our device and adding points to our score int. And that's very simple to do. So after our void statement here, we're going to space out the code here in our application so we can clearly see what we're typing out. I'm going to start by typing dash bracket void. And very much like how we learned in our last lecture to shake our device, we do motion begin void statement there. And we create our parentheses, brackets, and enter. And then what we're going to do is create our event. So if event.subtype is simply equal to UI event subtype motion shake. So if the event when we shake our device equals the shake gesture, then this is where our mode int comes into play. If mode int is equal to 1, then our score int will then plus equals, wrong way around, plus equals 1. And then what we're going to do then is get our code here where we display it in, paste it in. We're going to get our score label dot text to equal our score int. There we go. Else, we could choose to have else, but as there's going to be no other option in mode 2, we're not going to have it. So we're not going to put else on there. So only when our mode int is equaling 1 can, when we shake our device, plus 1. When our mode int equals 2, when our timer is stopped, because we have no code to perform anything when it's in mode 2, it's not going to do anything, so we can leave it as it is. So it's not until we go to build and run and test it out. Now when we got our game here, we can start it, which will put our game mode into int1. And as we started it there, we can go to our hard way, shake our device, it pluses 1. I can keep shaking it. And you can see there I've shook it 3 times to get a score of 3, which has now stopped the game. And if I go to now shaking device once more as the game has stopped, you can see it doesn't plus it up to 4. That's because our mode int has changed. So our users can't cheat by shaking their device when they're finished. So we literally got a score of 3. So I'm going to try and beat that now. So we restart our game, which we set it to if it equals 0, to reset all our stats and our labels, and change the button to start, and then disable it again. And then we press start, and I go up to hardware, to shake device, shake device, shake device, shake device, and we get one more in quickly. And this time I got it to 5, and again we can restart the game, and then press start, and again continue playing over and over again, and we see if we can beat our previous score. Now it's quite an addictive game to play, and you can see if you can change or compete with your mates. You can see that last one there, I didn't quite get it in, so my best is still at 5. As you learn further on in the course, you can go on to add graphics to this simple Shake Me application. You can add in social abilities to share your score with your friends or even on social media, and you can round this off into a perfect application, even going on to adding sound effects every time you shake. So again, as you progress further in the course and you learn more stuff to do, you can come back to these older application and games that we've created and add on to them. But there we go. We've used a simple action in terms of shaking the application to perform an action to creating it in a very simple and addictive fun game. So I hope this sparks your imagination into what you can create within your applications and taking this one step further. If you do and you evolve it into a nice rounded game, make sure you post in the forums some screenshots of your game to let me know how you got on. But now, in the next coming lectures, we're going to be continuing on creating actions from our objects.